The man who bought a broken police dog and changed everything. The auctioneer barely paused at the cage. Retired canine, slight aggression history, former handler, unknown, he rattled off like reading a grocery list. The crowd shifted, uneasy. A few laughed nervously. The dog inside, scarred, thin, trembling, made no sound. He didn't growl, didn't bark, just staring at the dirt. Then came a voice, not loud but firm. "I'll take him." All heads turned. Jonas Bishop, a reclusive veteran with more ghosts than friends, had never bought anything at an auction. But that day, something pulled him forward. The transaction was silent. The crowd murmured, "Why that one? Why a dog who looked like death was more merciful than a second chance?" But as Jonas walked away, the dog leaned just slightly into his leg. It was the first sign of life. It will not be the last. This isn't just a rescue story. It's the story of what happens when two survivors meet and find that healing begins, not with noise, but with presence. The air at the Redwood Bluff livestock auction carried a strange weight that day, part dust, part noise, and part something unspoken, like the heavy hush before a storm. Heat shimmered off rusted metal railings, the scent of hay, sweat, and diesel clung to everything, and over it all, a voice echoed, sharp, practiced, tired. The auctioneer's cadence bounced off wooden beams like a cracked whip. Cattle shifted in their pens. Buyers leaned against the rails, eyes narrowed, boots dusty. Then came the dog. He didn't come out the main chute. He was dragged through a side gate by a boy who looked like he wished he was anywhere else. The chain leash clanked. The dog stumbled once, caught himself, and limped into the ring. His back leg twisted awkwardly beneath him, barely functional. Every movement made it clearer. This dog had been broken in more ways than one. A German shepherd, though his coat, mottled with grime and streaked with old scars, hid the breed's once noble lines. His ribs pushed through his sides like blades. His ears twitched, but never perked. His eyes didn't plead. They didn't dart. They just stared forward, hollow and amber, like the light had long gone out and no one had bothered to relight it. The boy unclipped the chain and stepped back fast. "Lot 27, the auctioneer called, hesitating just a beat longer than usual. "Male German shepherd. 6 years, we think. Bit of a limp. Been used for work, maybe canine. No papers. As is." A smattering of murmurs rolled through the crowd. "Looks half dead. Probably bit someone. Not worth the feed. Put him down. Mercy." No one laughed. No one bid. Ghost, though no one knew that name yet, stood at the center of the ring like a shadow that had forgotten how to disappear. He didn't bark, didn't move. His tail stayed limp, dragging through the sawdust with every shift of weight. Flies gathered at the edges of a wound hidden beneath his haunch. The heat pressed down, and the dog trembled barely, but it was there. Not fear, not defiance, just resignation, like he already knew what came next. The auctioneer coughed. "All right then. No bids. Let's move." But then, a hand. Just one. Quiet. Steady. Rising from the far back corner, where no one had been paying attention. The movement was small, but in the stunned stillness it cracked the air like a thunderclap. The crowd turned. The auctioneer squinted. You bidding?" No reply, just a nod. He stood apart from the others. A man in a weathered coat, darker than the dust, shoulders heavy beneath its weight. His face was lined, beard gray at the chin. His eyes, half hidden beneath a worn cap, didn't flicker. He just looked at the dog like he already knew him. "Sold," the auctioneer muttered, almost to himself. He didn't shout it. There was no thrill of competition, just a gavel drop and a puzzled crowd. "Sir," someone whispered, nudging their neighbor, "he just paid for a corpse." But the man didn't answer the whispers. He stepped into the ring, slow, deliberate. The dog watched him. Not afraid, not hopeful, just observing, measuring. The man didn't speak, didn't call, didn't whistle. He knelt, and in that moment something shifted, something fragile, barely seen. Ghost didn't back away, didn't growl. He didn't lunge forward either, but he leaned, just barely, his weight shifting toward the man as if gravity had suddenly changed direction. And the man? He just opened his hand, not to grab, not to leash, just open, palm resting gently near the dog's shoulder. Ghost exhaled, a soft, shuddering breath. The noise of the auction faded into static. Someone recorded it on their phone. Later, the clip would circle online, a video of a scarred German shepherd pressing his weight into a stranger's hand. No audio, just stillness. And in that stillness, something sacred, something heavy. The world didn't know the man's name. Not yet. But that image man and dog, broken in different ways, choosing not to run, was already enough to start a story. He didn't say a word. No receipt was requested, no handshake exchanged, no thanks offered. The man whose name no one asked simply walked to the clerk's booth, laid down the payment in folded cash, and walked back toward the auction pen without even glancing at the crowd now staring at him like he'd grown horns. Whispers bloomed behind him like weeds. "He's crazy. Probably thinks he can fix it. Maybe it's guilt. Looks like a war guy. Poor mutt. Should have been put down. Mercy'd be kinder." But none of it reached Jonas. Not in any way that mattered. He didn't hear them. Or he did, and didn't care. His boots crunched through the sawdust as he stepped back into the ring. The dog hadn't moved, still standing, still trembling slightly in the heat. One back paw curled inward at an awkward angle, a twist that spoke of old damage and older neglect. The animal's fur was thick in places, matted in others, with tufts missing along the ribs and hips like someone had torn patches out with more force than care. Jonas knelt again. Not sudden, not cautious, just present. He reached for the leash. It was frayed, caked in dirt. The clip rattled against the dog's chain collar as he unhooked it. For a moment, there was nothing but stillness. The kind that teeters between fight or flight. The kind that makes everyone else hold their breath even if they don't know why. But Ghost didn't bolt. He didn't flinch. Instead, the dog did something that no one in the audience expected, something that felt almost too soft for this brutal world. He stepped forward, 1 beat, 1 inch, and let his shoulder touch the man's knee. Just that, a lean, not desperate, not dramatic, just a broken thing recognizing another. Jonas stood slowly, wrapping the leash once around his wrist. He didn't tug, didn't guide. He simply turned and began walking. And Ghost followed. The crowd parted like water, not out of awe, but confusion. There were no applause, no gasps, just murmurs chasing Jonas and the dog across the lot like shadows trying to catch up. That's not a rescue. That's suicide. Must have lost someone. Has that look. He doesn't even know what that dog's been through. Maybe they were right. Maybe Jonas didn't know. But when he glanced down at Ghost as they stepped off the gravel into the softer earth by the fence line, there was no hesitation in his eyes. No pity either. Just a grim kind of knowing. Like he'd seen enough wounded things to recognize when one wasn't done yet, when it still had some ember left to protect. Ghost walked at his side, limping, yes, but willingly. Head low, tail neither tucked nor wagging, just hanging in a kind of resigned equilibrium. He didn't look back at the yard, not once, and Jonas never looked at the people. When they reached the truck, Jonas opened the rusted tailgate. He didn't lift the dog, didn't force him up. Ghost stared at the open bed for a long moment. Then, as if deciding that this particular kind of unknown was better than the one behind him, he hoisted himself up slow, awkward, and curled into the corner beneath an old wool blanket. Not asleep, just small, still watching. Jonas closed the gate gently. A younger man leaning against a water trough nearby crossed his arms. "Why that one?" he asked, not unkind, but confused. Jonas glanced at him but said nothing. He only opened the driver's side door, paused halfway in, and answered the question with a sentence that barely qualified as sound. Because he didn't ask for anything. And then he got in, started the truck, and left. The gravel crunched beneath tires as the vehicle pulled away, heading east. Toward the woods, toward the trees, toward whatever ghosts lived out past where the road gave up and the wild began. And in the truck bed, the dog named Ghost blinked slow, letting the wind slip past his ears, eyes half-lidded, bones sore. But for the first time in what felt like years, he didn't feel like something being dragged to die. He didn't know where he was going, but he wasn't going alone. The road out of Redwood Bluff narrowed quickly. Pavement gave way to gravel, then gravel gave way to dust. Jonas's truck, a battered 1991 Chevy with a door that creaked on turns and a rear-view mirror held together by old glue and stubbornness, rumbled over every rut like it knew the way by memory. The tires kicked up trails of dirt behind them, disappearing into the pines like they'd never existed. In the back, Ghost didn't sleep. He curled tight in the corner of the truck bed, head resting against a frayed tarp, one eye cracked just enough to watch the world slide by. His body swayed slightly with every bend in the road, but he never whined, never adjusted, just lay there, as if movement wasn't worth the effort. A branch snapped beneath the wheels, and he twitched shoulder first, then hind leg. Not startled, just wired, like the reaction had been carved into his muscles long ago. From the driver's seat, Jonas watched. Not constantly, he knew better than to stare, but in short, quiet glances through the mirror. He took in every flinch, every breath. Every time the dog looked like he wanted to close his eyes, but couldn't trust what he'd see if he did. The silence in the cab was thick. No radio, no voice. Just the soft rattle of tools under the seat and the hum of the engine trying to forget how old it was. And through the windshield, the forest began to rise. Clearwater Pines wasn't marked on any proper map. You had to know the dips in the trail, the moss-covered rock that signaled the last turn, the sharp bend by the fallen birch that looked like a claw reaching from the earth. Jonas had driven it 100 times, but today felt different. Today the truck wasn't just taking him home. It was carrying something broken, something scarred, something too quiet for its own good. They passed the rusted mile marker near the foot of the ridge. Beyond it, the world turned thick with trees and memory. Jonas gripped the wheel tighter. It wasn't that he hadn't brought animals home before. Injured birds, a deer once, bleeding from a poacher's snare, a stray cat that refused to leave until the first snowfall. But this This was different. This dog wasn't just hurt. He was haunted. And Jonas, for reasons he hadn't dared to name yet, felt it. Like the air had shifted when he raised his hand at the auction. Like something in the universe had leaned forward and whispered, "This is yours now." The final turn came without warning. A clearing opened like breath after drowning. The cabin stood at the center, tucked into a grove of lodgepoles and soft earth. Its roof sloped with the weight of years. The porch sagged slightly, one corner tied up with wire and an old shovel handle. The windows were dusty, but not broken. A woodpile, perfectly stacked by habit more than necessity, rested near the side. Jonas slowed the truck to a crawl. As the engine cut, the world fell quiet. Not silent, Clearwater never was, but still. The kind of stillness you earned. The kind that whispered instead of shouted. He stepped out first, boots crunching against pine needles. The scent of sap and old rain filled the air. He walked to the back and lowered the tailgate without a sound. Ghost didn't move at first. He looked at Jonas. Not in fear, not in hope, just waiting, as if trying to understand what came next. Jonas didn't speak. He didn't gesture. He simply stepped aside, giving space. Ghost shifted slowly, front paws stretching before back ones dared to follow. He landed hard on the dirt, favoring his bad leg, then stood still, scanning the trees like they might swallow him whole. Jonas turned toward the porch, giving the dog room to decide. Ghost followed, not close, not far, just enough. The cabin door creaked open. Dust motes swirled in the light as they stepped inside. Wood walls, iron stove, a single table, a fireplace lined with soot and memory. Nothing fancy, nothing new. Jonas pointed to a corner near the hearth. There, an old blanket already lay spread across a thick rug, waiting somehow for the shape that would fill it. He didn't say sit, didn't pat his leg, didn't need to. Ghost limped forward, circled once, and curled up without sound. His eyes stayed open, but this time he blinked. Jonas exhaled, slow, quiet. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it wasn't nothing. And in Clearwater Pines, not nothing was a start. The cabin never needed much light. Jonas had built it that way, out of instinct, more than design. The windows were small, framed thick with pine, and the overhead bulb above the table rarely flickered to life unless something had to be stitched or sharpened. Tonight, it stayed off. Only the fireplace burned. Its flames danced low and steady, casting flickering amber over the room's wood-grain skin. The walls, worn and knot-patched, caught the glow like old bones remembering warmth. Outside, the forest breathed through the cracked window, cold and damp, the kind of night that made silence curl in around itself like smoke. Ghost lay near the hearth, exactly where Jonas had placed the folded blanket. He hadn't moved since. The bowl of food-warm chicken, rice, soft broth, sat untouched at his paws. Jonas had set it down gently, crouched nearby for a moment, then backed away with no comment. He didn't coax, didn't call, just watched from across the room with his coffee cooling in both hands. The dog wasn't asleep, but he wasn't fully awake either. His ears twitched every so often, catching the creak of floorboards or the tick of the stove expanding in the heat. His body, curled into itself, remained tense at the edges, like a soldier dozing with one eye open. Jonas sat on the edge of the armchair, elbows on knees, gaze fixed on the fire. Not for the warmth, but for the rhythm. Something about it steadied him. It always had. He took a long breath, let it out. "I've lived here 12 winters," he said quietly. Not to the dog, not to the room, maybe not even to himself. Just spoken, like language needed to exist again after hours of being locked in his throat. Never brought anything back from town that wasn't canned or bleeding. The logs crackled softly. Ghost didn't stir. Jonas glanced over. The dog's eyes were open, barely, still watching, not alert, not trusting, but aware. That was enough. He took another sip of coffee, grimaced at the bitterness, then set the mug down on the floor beside him. He leaned back in his chair, hand resting loosely on the armrest, and let the silence reclaim the space. For a while the only sound was the fire. Then slowly, as if testing the air, Jonas leaned forward again. His voice dropped even further, half whisper, half memory. "Your name is Ghost now." The room didn't react. No cue from the wind, no flicker of flame. But the dog twitched just slightly. One ear curved back, then forward again. Not confusion, not command recognition. Just the faintest sign that the sound had registered somewhere beneath the ribs. Jonas didn't smile. He didn't repeat it. He simply said it again, softer, slower, like it mattered. "Ghost." The dog's eyes blinked once. Then nothing. Jonas leaned back again and closed his own eyes, not to sleep, but to rest something deeper. Across the room, Ghost shifted. Not much. Just enough for his bad leg to stretch a fraction closer to the heat. His nose pressed into the blanket. His breath evened. The bowl of food remained untouched. But for the first time since entering the cabin, he sighed. Not loud, not long. Just a single exhausted release, like a door somewhere in his chest had creaked open, even if only by a sliver. Jonas didn't move. He didn't speak again. Because in that moment, two figures in the glow of a fading fire, one man sinking into his silence, and one dog curled beneath a forgotten name, there was something forming that couldn't be rushed. Not trust, but something before it. The cabin held its breath, and outside the forest listened. The fire burned low by midnight, casting long shadows that stretched and curled along the floor like restless memories. The cabin, wrapped in the hush of forest wind and pine-settled silence, held itself together with the faint crackle of embers and the subtle creak of old wood adjusting to the cold. Jonas didn't sleep. He sat slouched in the armchair, one leg stretched toward the fireplace, arms folded across his chest, a blanket draped halfway over his lap. His eyes had closed more than once, but something in him, some half-formed instinct honed in darker places, refused to fully shut down. Across the room, Ghost didn't sleep either. The dog hadn't moved in hours, but he was far from still. From his corner near the hearth he watched Jonas with the unblinking intensity of a soldier surveying a perimeter. His chest rose slow, measured. His head lay low, ears swiveling at every sound the cabin made. Settling beams, a gust through the chimney, the quiet breath of a man not quite dreaming. There was no aggression in his eyes, but there was no softness either. Just that military stillness, as if his bones were trained to wait, as if sleeping near humans came with risk. At one point, Jonas shifted slightly, and Ghost's pupils dilated, not wide, but sharply. A pulse, a calculation. His paw scraped against the rug with the faintest friction, claws catching cloth, like he was deciding if he needed to run. Jonas didn't react. Instead, he reached forward slow, deliberate. until his hand hovered just above the floor. He didn't try to touch, didn't reach for fur or press into space that wasn't his, just laid his palm, open and still, in the inches between them. Ghost didn't move. Seconds passed, then a minute, and then, almost too soft to notice, his paw shifted. Not a lunge, not a warning, a slide. The edge of his front paw crept forward across the blanket until one clawed toe touched skin. No growl, no retreat, just a quiet point of contact, as if his body had remembered what it meant to initiate something without being punished for it. Jonas didn't look down. He didn't speak. He simply kept breathing slow and steady, as though any sudden inhale might break whatever fragile thing had started to form in that space between skin and scar. Ghost held his position, eyes still trained on Jonas's chest, not his hand, as if looking directly might make it too real, too vulnerable, but he didn't pull away. That was everything. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows in low, intermittent sighs. Inside, the two of them stayed like that man and dog, tethered by nothing but air and shared stillness for what felt like an entire season. Eventually, Ghost shifted again, just a little, enough to rest his head back on his paws. The contact remained, the paw still brushing against Jonas's hand, a quiet allowance. Jonas exhaled, long and low, letting his arms slowly relax beside him on the rug. He didn't pet, didn't praise. He knew better than to scare off a ghost with sound. Instead, he leaned back into the chair, gaze softening toward the dimming hearth. The fire cracked one last time, sending a faint shower of sparks upward. The warmth of it reached across the room, not just in temperature, but in something more ancestral, something that lived beneath words. And in that flickering quiet, Jonas said nothing. Because some moments didn't need language, they just needed not to be broken. The morning crept into the cabin the way winter light always did, gray, reluctant, and low. Frost fogged the bottom corners of the windows, softening the outlines of trees just beyond the glass. Pine needles shimmered silver where the sun hadn't yet reached, and the whole forest seemed to pause in that hush between dark and day. Inside, the wood stove still radiated faint warmth from the night's fire. Embers glowed dimly beneath ash. The air smelled of smoke, dry pine, and something faintly bitter Jonas's coffee, strong enough to wake the dead and rough enough to remind the living. He moved quietly, wool socks against floorboards, the steady clink of a pan, a tin bowl filled with gently warmed chicken and rice, stirred with slow hands and care no one would expect from a man who hadn't spoken more than a few dozen words in the past 24 hours. Ghost didn't lift his head at first. He lay in the same place Jonas had found him hours ago, near the hearth, body curled tight, eyes half-lidded, but never closed. Not truly. One ear flicked at the sound of meat dropping into the bowl, another at the groan of the kettle. Jonas crouched, set the food down a few feet away, then returned to the low step just beside the stove. He didn't push the bowl closer, didn't whistle or clap, just waited, mug in hand, watching steam rise into the cabin's quiet ceiling. A minute passed, then another. Ghost stirred. Slowly, his front paw uncurled, his head lifting inch by inch like it weighed more than his frame could handle. He didn't look at the food first. He looked at Jonas, not directly, just enough to clock the distance. Then he looked at the bowl. Another beat. His body shifted, careful, calculated. His back leg dragged slightly as he stood. Limping, he moved toward the bowl in short steps, pausing once when the floor creaked beneath him. His tail remained low, motionless, but his nose quivered as it neared the edge of the metal rim. Jonas said nothing. Ghost sniffed. Then finally he ate. Not the frantic gobbling of a starving stray, not the cautious licking of a dog unsure of poison, but something in between, measured bites, slow chews. He stopped after the third one, looked up, back at Jonas. The man hadn't moved. Ghost took 2 more bites, paused again, watched. Jonas kept sipping the bitter coffee like it was the most natural thing in the world to share space with a half-feral soul inching toward trust. When the dog finished, he sat beside the bowl, not resting, not retreating, just still. Jonas set down his mug, stood, moved toward the sink. Ghost didn't flinch, but his body tensed just enough for Jonas to notice. He rinsed the spoon and bowl in silence, dried them with the towel slung over his shoulder, folded it neatly and returned it to the hook by the stove. Then he turned slowly and met Ghost's gaze. "Not bad," he said softly. "Just that." Ghost blinked. No tail wag, no sound. But he didn't back away. And in this place, in this moment, that was its own kind of communion. Outside, the frost on the porch railing began to melt in thin streaks as sunlight finally pushed through the trees. Inside, a man moved through his kitchen, and a dog sat on worn floorboards, belly warm, body sore, mind tired, but not afraid. Not for now. And that was enough. By the third day, the frost clung less stubbornly to the cabin windows. Morning light reached farther across the floorboards, stretching long fingers of pale gold toward the hearth where Ghost now spent most of his time. He no longer curled into a defensive coil, still alert, still stiff, but not hiding. Jonas noticed the shift. He didn't comment on it, didn't name it as progress. He simply moved a little slower near the dog now, not out of fear, but out of something gentler, respect maybe, or understanding. Ghost had started following him in small ways, not through doorways, not across rooms, but when Jonas stood from his chair, the dog's ears would perk. When he stepped outside to chop wood, Ghost would shift closer to the window, a kind of shadowing tentative, cautious, but real. That afternoon, Jonas fetched the brush from the small metal bin near the back door. He knelt beside Ghost, speaking only once. "Let's see what winter left behind." Ghost didn't move away. He watched, head lowered but unthreatened. Jonas began with slow, practiced strokes along the shoulder's tangled fur, loosened gently by coarse bristles and patience. The coat was thick in some spots, matted in others, places where healing hadn't reached yet. Ghost exhaled once, his eyes half closed, and Jonas thought, just for a moment, that maybe they'd turned a corner. But then his hand drifted lower. The brush caught on a knot of fur near Ghost's hindquarters, just above the hip, where scar tissue had knotted the skin beneath the surface. He didn't press hard, didn't even notice the resistance at first. But Ghost did. The reaction was instant. A guttural snarl ripped from deep in the dog's throat. Not angry, not threatening, but terrified. A warning born in trauma. In the same second, Ghost spun on his good leg, eyes wide, teeth bared, snapping the air between them not to bite, but to protect the space around his own body. Jonas froze. The brush clattered to the floor. Ghost backed into the far corner of the room, trembling, ears pinned flat. His legs were tense, shaking, his tail tucked so hard it nearly touched his ribs. His whole frame quivered like something waiting for punishment. but none came. Jonas didn't yell, didn't reach. He slowly knelt, right there, where the brush had dropped, palms down, empty, open. Then he did what few men would have thought to do. He waited. The room stretched with the weight of those minutes. Ghost panted hard. His chest rose and fell in sharp, short bursts. His eyes darted toward the windows, toward the door, toward Jonas. Jonas stayed still. He let the silence settle between them, let the fear burn through its cycle. He didn't speak, didn't offer food or affection. He just held space. 1 minute, then 2, 5, 8. At 10 minutes, Ghost took a step forward. His tail remained low, body still shaking, but his head dipped slightly. He looked not at Jonas's face, but at the man's outstretched hand, fingers slack, knuckles scraped raw from years of things no one asked about, hands that had once held rifles, dug trenches, tended wounds, buried people. Now they only waited. Ghost sniffed once, then again, and finally, slowly, he pressed the edge of his snout into the space between Jonas's thumb and forefinger. Just a breath, just a second, and then he pulled back. Jonas exhaled, quiet and careful, like he didn't want to break the air. "That's all right," he whispered. "I won't touch what you're not ready to give." Ghost blinked. His chest still heaved, but the tension in his spine loosened, barely. He turned away and lay down, not at the hearth, but not far from Jonas either, facing him, not curled in defense, but stretched halfway out, ears flicking with each sound, but not pinned. Jonas didn't move to retrieve the brush. He didn't need to. Some wounds weren't ready to be cleaned, some were just meant to be seen. And maybe that was the beginning. That night the cabin felt colder than usual. Not because of the weather, though the temperature had dipped again, and the wind whispered harder through the trees, but because of something else. Something weightless but heavy. Something Ghost had left behind in the silence after his panic. Jonas didn't try again with the brush. He didn't reach for it when the dog lay curled near the hearth, eyes half closed but alert, watching him as he moved about the cabin with slower, softer steps. Instead, he cleaned the stove, restacked the firewood, refilled the kettle, gave the illusion of normal. But beneath it, something shifted. That flinch, the snarl, the tremble, the way Ghost had braced for pain that never came, had sunk beneath Jonas's skin like frostbite, and it wouldn't thaw. By the time the fire was lit and dinner was quietly set aside, Jonas knelt beside Ghost with a folded towel and a bowl of warm water, not to brush, not to bathe, just to see. Ghost didn't move as Jonas dipped the cloth and gently began wiping dirt and soot from the dog's back. It was slow work, done without words. His fingers worked in circular strokes, careful to avoid the spot near the hip. But then, under the edge of the shoulder blade, just beneath a patch of tangled fur, his fingertips caught something. A ridge, smooth and unnatural. Jonas parted the fur with the damp cloth, his breath stilled. A perfect circle. Dark, scarred, no hair growing through, raised slightly from the surrounding skin. He leaned in closer. His thumb found another one, and then a third barely visible, hidden under years of regrowth and grime. All in places no dog could scratch, lick, or bite. All in areas where a human hand would have to hold the animal still to inflict. Jonas didn't curse. He didn't flinch, but his face went blank in that particular way trauma does, where the body goes still so the mind doesn't scream. He kept looking. One by one, the wounds appeared like ghosts rising under moonlight, each a small, round monument to deliberate pain, some old, some newer. but all intentional. His eyes didn't move, but something behind them changed, something slow, cold, final. Ghost didn't react. He didn't tremble, didn't shift away. He simply watched Jonas with those deep, silent eyes, as if waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. Jonas set the cloth down. He didn't stand. He just knelt there for a long moment, hand hovering over the last burn mark, not touching it, not moving, just existing near it, witnessing it. When he finally spoke, it was a whisper. "Who the hell did this to you?" Not a question. Not really. More like a statement his soul wasn't ready to accept the answer to. He stood slowly, knees cracking, and stepped back from Ghost, not out of fear, but out of reverence, as if the dog had just revealed something sacred, something terrible, and Jonas didn't want to contaminate it with movement. He crossed the room, opened the drawer near the sink, and pulled out an old canteen filled with whiskey. He took a long, burning sip. His jaw clenched. His throat didn't loosen, but it helped keep the scream down. He stared out the window. The trees didn't answer. The wind didn't shift. But something in Jonas did. Because it was one thing to rescue a broken dog. It was another to realize someone had broken him on purpose. The fire had dimmed to a slow orange pulse by the time Jonas pulled the journal from beneath the bed. It was thick, leather-bound, worn smooth at the edges, like something carried through too many years and too many regrets. The pages had curled from moisture once, long ago, and they still crackled faintly when he opened them. There were words already on the first half, some legible, others scratched out, others just single names floating like ghosts between torn sentences. He hadn't written in it in over a year, maybe longer. Jonas sat at the small wooden table near the window. The lamp cast a low cone of light across the page. He didn't check the lock on the door, didn't warm up another drink. His hands smelled faintly of firewood and dog fur, and his knuckles bore tiny scratches from the encounter earlier. He took the pen like it might bite. Then, without any ceremony, he began. "Riverside Depot, the alley behind Grant Street, 2010. A pause. "Kyle Danners. Used to talk too fast. Smoked menthols. Laughed when he shouldn't have." Another pause. "Dead at 28. The words came harder after that. Not in style, not in poetry, but in weight. Every line etched from some corner of him he didn't speak to anymore. The places he used to go, the faces he didn't tell anyone he remembered. The moments when he'd looked away. Or worse, when he hadn't. He kept writing. The Wilcox Ranch, the back barn, summer with no rain. Dogs, not barking, just breathing, waiting. He gritted his teeth, pressed the pen too hard. The tip tore a thin groove in the next page. Ghost shifted behind him. Jonas didn't look up, but he stopped writing. A soft whimper floated through the room. Not loud, not long, just one of those broken, involuntary sounds that slip through when sleep turns dangerous. Ghost's paws twitched against the floorboards. His tail jerked once. Jonas set the pen down, closed the journal halfway. He crossed the room slowly, boots leaving hollow taps on the pine. The dog was still curled by the hearth, body tight, eyes closed, breathing quick. Jonas crouched beside him, not close, just near. He reached out, hand hovering in the air above Ghost's flank, not touching. Not this time. Just present. The dog whimpered again, softer now, a sound that sounded like it had traveled a long way to get here. a sound from another life. Jonas whispered, voice low and frayed, "You're not there anymore." The words hung in the dark, catching on the timbered walls like smoke. And maybe they weren't just for the dog. Maybe they were for him too. He whispered it again. "You're not there anymore." This time, Ghost's breath slowed. His limbs stilled. The tension eased, not gone but loosened like a knot with a little slack. Jonas stayed for a while. Just breathing. Just sharing the air. Then, quietly, he stood, returned to the table, picked up the journal. On the next page he wrote 5 more words. The burns weren't an accident. He didn't sign it, didn't date it. Some things were never meant for anyone else to read. The morning broke with birdsong and cold. Jonas had been chopping wood behind the cabin since sunrise, half for the fire, half to keep his hands busy. Ghost watched from the porch, one paw draped lazily over the edge, ears flicking with every swing of the axe. They'd settled into something that resembled rhythm, even if neither of them would have called it trust. Just cohabitation. A truce built on silence and space until the bowl dropped. It happened fast, too fast to catch. Jonas had brought in the bundle of split logs and was setting Ghost's food on the floor near the hearth when the old metal bowl slipped from his grip, hit the floor with a sharp clang that echoed like a gunshot in the stillness of the cabin. Ghost exploded backward. Not a bark, not a flinch. An eruption. In half a second his body launched across the room, head low, hackles raised, teeth bared in a snarl that didn't belong to a house dog. His front legs planted like steel, muscles taut, tail stiff and straight. His eyes weren't wide with fear. They were narrowed with reaction. Trained reaction. Jonas froze, hands open. "Easy," he said, voice calm, low. But Ghost wasn't hearing voice. He was hearing metal. The bowl spun on the floor like a taunt, a remnant of something long buried. Ghost's body trembled, not from panic but from restraint, like something inside him wanted to finish a task that no longer existed. Jonas didn't move. He waited until the bowl finally settled with a hollow ring, then took one slow step toward it. Ghost growled low, guttural, deep from the gut. A warning. Jonas stopped. Their eyes met across the room, not man and pet, but survivor to survivor. That growl said more than pain. It said, "Don't make me choose between what I was made to do and what I'm trying to forget." Jonas nodded once, stepped back. Ghost blinked. The growl faded. His body slowly lowered. His front legs collapsed beneath him as he exhaled hard through his nose. The muscles in his shoulders twitched, then stilled. He turned away from the bowl. But Jonas had already stopped thinking about food. His mind was still caught in the way Ghost moved. The posture, the speed, the control. It wasn't fear. It was training. He didn't panic like a shelter dog. He reacted like something taught to survive violence by becoming part of it. Jonas walked to the storage trunk near the back door, pulled it open. Inside, beneath a folded wool blanket, lay his old duffel bag. Dusty. Untouched for years. He didn't know what made him do it. Call it instinct. Or maybe guilt. He unzipped it and pulled out the first thing he ever stopped wearing when he left that world behind. A tan field jacket stained at the cuffs, rank patch still sewn to the shoulder. He turned. Ghost was watching him. And the moment the jacket cleared the edge of the trunk, the dog stood not aggressive, not wagging. Frozen. His tail dropped, his ears lowered, not back, not tucked, just guarded. Jonas held the jacket up, slowly. Ghost's entire body shifted into stillness, his head lowered, chest squared, legs braced evenly. The same stance Jonas had seen 100 times overseas, through dust storms and night vision, through gunfire and silence. Only now, it was coming from a dog. Jonas let the jacket fall onto the chair. Ghost's eyes didn't move. The air inside the cabin thickened, like it was holding its breath. Jonas spoke, softer than before. "Where were you trained?" Ghost didn't answer. But something in his body twitched at the word trained. A memory? A scar? Or just the shape of that syllable, meaning pain is coming, but it comes with rules? Jonas took a slow step back. Sat down. His heart thudded once, heavy. He'd seen dogs like this, but only on missions that didn't make it into the paperwork. Dogs that weren't rescued, they were built, rewired to protect until they broke. Programmed with aggression, turned into weapons, then tossed aside when they faltered. Ghost wasn't just abused, he'd been conditioned, and whoever had done it with purpose. The knock came like a fault line cracking through the quiet. 3 slow, deliberate taps against the cabin door, each one spaced just far enough apart to make Jonas sit up straighter, the weight of old instincts settling in his spine like ice. He looked at the clock. 12:03 a.m. Not a time for visitors. Not out here. Ghost stirred by the hearth. Not a bark, not a growl. Just a shift, his body rising slowly, legs stiff, head tilting toward the door before Jonas had even moved. Jonas stood, quiet as breath, and reached for the revolver tucked into the cabinet drawer habit, not paranoia. He didn't unlock the door right away, just peered through the small glass pane carved into the center. Lance Dwyer. Still wearing that canvas deputy marshal jacket with the frayed collar and scuffed badge, like he hadn't updated his wardrobe since the war. His jaw was unshaven, his breath clouded in the cold. His face didn't say emergency, but it didn't say routine either. Jonas opened the door halfway. "Evening?" Dwyer said, voice low, steady. Jonas gave him a nod. "Little late, isn't it?" Dwyer shifted his weight. "Didn't want to call. Figured I'd come in person." Jonas opened the door the rest of the way, stepped aside. "Coffee's cold. Hope you're not picky." The deputy stepped in. Ghost stayed by the fire, eyes locked on the stranger's boots, posture alert but not hostile. But the moment Dwyer's voice carried again, something in the dog's stance hardened. Dwyer didn't notice. "There was a break-in out past the timber line," he said. "Wilcox Ranch." Jonas froze, and Ghost stiffened. Not just the usual canine awareness. This was deeper, sharper, primal. His tail dropped. His chest expanded with a breath that sounded more like restraint than air. Jonas didn't look at the dog yet. He kept his eyes on Dwyer. "Someone living out there now?" Dwyer shook his head. "No one should be. Place has been dead for years. Sheriff's office wrote it off after that foreclosure mess." He paused. "But someone got inside. Barn door was forced open, interiors trashed, like they were looking for something specific." Jonas's mouth tightened. "And you came all this way to tell me that?" "You used to work there," Dwyer said. "You know the layout. And—" His eyes flicked toward Ghost. "You've got company now." Ghost hadn't moved, but his eyes were locked, not on Dwyer, on the door, as if the word Wilcox had unlocked something that had no business waking up. Jonas followed his line of sight, then crouched next to him, one hand hovering near the dog's shoulder, not touching, just grounding. "You know that name?" he asked softly. Ghost didn't look at him. Didn't need to. The answer lived in the way his body had gone cold and still. Jonas turned back to Dwyer, jaw tight. "I'll drive out in the morning." "You sure?" Dwyer asked. "I'm sure." The deputy handed him a slip of paper, coordinates, a time stamp. Then, just before stepping back out into the night, he glanced once more at Ghost. That one's seen more than most. Jonas closed the door behind him, bolted it, then leaned against it for a long breath. Ghost was still staring at the wood, body tense, and Jonas knew. That ranch wasn't just a place Ghost remembered. It was a place he survived, and whatever was buried there, it had started to stir. The shed behind the cabin hadn't been opened in years. Its hinges groaned in protest as Jonas pried the warped door back, the wood cracking like old bone in the cold. Dust hung thick in the air, catching in the beam of his flashlight as he stepped inside, ducking under the low frame. The air inside was still, too still, as if it had been waiting. Ghost didn't follow him in. He stood just outside the doorway, body outlined by moonlight, unmoving, watching. Not like a dog curious about a space his human had entered, more like a witness, more like someone who already knew what was buried inside. Jonas crouched in the back corner, moving aside 2 rusted toolboxes and a tarp stiff with mildew. Beneath them, nearly hidden under a layer of dried leaves and forgotten time, was a wooden crate military issue, reinforced at the corners with blackened iron. One latch was missing, the other still locked tight. He pulled a key from around his neck, small, brass, worn thin from friction against memory. The lock snapped open with a quiet click. Jonas hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside, the sediment of a past he'd spent the last decade pretending didn't belong to him. A photo on top, creased and faded, showed a younger Jonas standing beside another German shepherd. This one was stockier than Ghost, with a fresh coat and alert ears. The background was a barn, barely in frame. Jonas's arm was slung loosely around the dog's neck. Neither of them smiled. He set the photo aside. Beneath it, a stack of folded documents, job logs, invoices, field reports, most stamped with Wilcox Ranch across the header. He flipped through slowly, his fingers trembling just slightly, the way they used to before he walked into a house that might not be empty. And then, a name. His own. Next to the phrase, shoeing, fence work, livestock transport, no questions. Jonas stared at the page, and something behind his eyes darkened, not with shock, but with recognition. He had signed this. He had been paid for this, not to hurt, not directly, but to look the other way. To build fences he never asked to see beyond. To haul animals and not ask why some never came back. His thumb grazed the bottom of the page. The ink had bled slightly, but the name beside the payment line was unmistakable. Rourke. The man who ran Wilcox, the man who paid in cash and silence. Jonas shut his eyes. The cabin behind him was only a few dozen yards away, but it felt like another life entirely. Outside, Ghost hadn't moved. Jonas turned the flashlight toward him. The dog's eyes reflected the light, catching it like a mirror. He stood in perfect stillness, tail low, head high, not fearful, not curious, knowing. Because this wasn't just about Jonas's past anymore. It was Ghost's, too. And in some way neither of them had words for. They were standing in the ashes of the same fire. Jonas packed the papers back into the crate, sealed it, but didn't lock it. He stood in the open doorway, breathing the night air like it might make the weight lighter. It didn't. Ghost approached, finally, slow, deliberate, and stopped a few feet away. Jonas looked down at him. "You've been here before," he said softly. Ghost blinked. Then he did something he hadn't done since the day they met. He stepped forward, leaned gently against Jonas's leg. No command, no reward, just a touch. And in that quiet, under the roof of a shed, neither of them wanted to return to, man and dog stood together. Two witnesses, two survivors, two names tied to a place they never truly left. The gravel cracked under the tires like old bones as Jonas turned off the main road and onto the path that led to Wilcox Ranch. The truck rocked over every rut and scar in the earth, just as it had years ago when this place still had a working gate, livestock in the pens, and lies poured smoother than water. Now, it was all rot and ghosts. Fences sagged under their own weight. The roof of the far barn had caved in on itself like a rib cage crushed from above. Shattered windows stared back at them, eyes long devoid of purpose. Ghost stood tall in the passenger seat, stiff with attention, his breath fogging the glass. Not anxious, not panicked, wired, every muscle coiled. Jonas parked without cutting the engine right away. He let the silence press down first, like the place needed permission to speak again. Then he opened the door. Ghost jumped out before the truck fully stopped rocking. He didn't wait, didn't look back. He knew where to go. Jonas followed without a word, boots crunching over frost-laced grass, the chill biting at his knuckles. They passed the main barn, its doors half torn from the hinges, a broken feeding trough jutting out like a bone. Flakes of red paint clung to the walls, like they were afraid to let go. Ghost didn't pause. He moved past the corral, the rusted-out water trough, and into the back field toward the tree line. Jonas remembered this place. It wasn't on the main layout, not marked on the job maps Rourke handed out. But the field was always quiet, always off-limits, even when no one said so. There were no cameras, no pens, just overgrowth and shadows. Ghost reached a patch of ground where the grass turned oddly short-trampled, but not recently. The soil was darker there, not black, just bruised. He circled once, then dropped his front paws and began to dig, not frantically, not like a dog chasing scent or instinct, but methodically, controlled, focused, as if he remembered the depth. Jonas joined him. He didn't ask. He just dropped to his knees beside Ghost and pushed his hands into the cold earth. The ground fought back stiff with ice, thick with roots. But after 10 minutes, Jonas's fingers struck metal. The hollow thud echoed differently than rock. Deeper. They cleared the rest together, man and dog side by side, dirt under nails, breath visible in the cold. And then the box came free, rust-eaten, padlocked, military issue. Jonas sat back on his heels. His hands trembled not from cold, but memory. His breath fogged out once, slow, deliberate. Then he pried it open with a crowbar he'd carried in his coat since leaving the cabin. The lock snapped. The lid groaned. Inside papers, photos, ledgers, most of them warped by moisture, edges curling like dead leaves. But the contents were clear enough. Polaroids, dogs in cages, some with tags stapled to their kennels, some with visible injuries, bite muzzles, shock collars. Ghost stood above the box and did not look away. Jonas flipped through the papers, auction slips, transaction logs, each page more damning than the last. Then he found the one he didn't want to see. A pay stub. His name. In ink. He didn't remember writing. Dated 5 years ago. Itemized. Shoeing, transport, no questions. The phrase hit harder this time, because now he could see what that transport had meant, what the no questions had enabled. He reached down to close the box. Ghost stopped him with a single paw pressed gently against the lid. Jonas looked at him, and Ghost looked back, eyes steady, fixed, as if to say, "Not yet. Not until you see all of it." Jonas's throat tightened. He took a breath that didn't feel like his, and he kept looking. The cold had seeped into Jonas's knees, but he barely felt it. The rusted box sat open between him and Ghost like a wound that had just been cut wide. It didn't scream, it didn't bleed, but it told the truth in pictures and ink and silence. He picked up the first Polaroid. A young German shepherd, thin, collar biting into his neck, eyes sunken in. The metal cage behind him was too small. No straw, no light, just concrete, rust, and something behind the eyes that Jonas couldn't unsee. The next photo was worse, and the one after that. Some of the dogs had tags stapled above their heads with numbers instead of names. Some had open sores, burns. One photo showed a man's gloved hand holding a prod to a shepherd's rib cage frozen mid-motion. The dog's body blurred in flinch. Jonas swallowed hard. The pages beneath the photos were invoices, all stamped with cold, bureaucratic efficiency dates, weights, delivery logs, a system designed to make pain look like procedure. Then came the payment records. He flipped through with fingers that trembled, not because he didn't know what he was going to find, but because he did. Page 4. There it was. His name, typed neatly beside a number. Jonas Reed Shoeing, transport, no questions. No questions. It echoed in his chest louder than any gunfire he'd ever known. It was a line he'd crossed years ago and told himself didn't matter. Because he hadn't done the hurting. Because he hadn't seen the cages. Because it was just a job. But now, the job had a face, and it was sitting beside him, covered in old scars, with eyes that didn't blink. Jonas lowered the page slowly, afraid if he folded it, it might scream. He stared at his own signature for a long moment. It looked like someone else's, someone younger, someone who thought the past could stay buried if he never spoke it aloud. He didn't hear Ghost move, just felt the weight of a paw pressed gently against his thigh. Jonas looked down. Ghost had inched forward, slow and quiet. His body was still tense, but his eyes met Jonas's, not with accusation, not even sadness. Recognition. Jonas's voice cracked. "You were one of them, weren't you?" Ghost didn't answer, but the silence he offered felt heavier than words. Jonas blinked hard, jaw clenched so tight it ached. "I helped build it," he whispered. "I didn't know what was going on in those barns, but I didn't ask either. I didn't stop." Ghost's paw stayed on his leg. No bark, no retreat, just quiet presence. The kind people mistake for forgiveness, but is really just survival saying, "I'm still here, and so are you." Jonas ran his hand over his face, then reached out slowly and placed his palm atop Ghost's paw. For a second, they just sat there in a field of frost and rot and buried sins, with nothing but rust and shame between them. But it was enough. Because sometimes reckoning doesn't come with sirens or trials. Sometimes it comes with one scarred dog reaching toward the man who once turned away, and deciding to stay. The box sat closed now, damp earth clinging to its corners. Jonas had wrapped it in an old canvas tarp from the truck bed, the weight of it heavier than it should have been, not because of what it physically held, but because of what it proved. He and Ghost stood in the center of the clearing, the late afternoon sun slanting through the trees in long, pale beams. The light caught the frost still clinging to the underbrush, making it look almost peaceful. But Jonas's spine prickled. They weren't alone. He didn't hear footsteps, didn't see motion, but something in the air shifted. Ghost's ears went up first. His head turned toward the barns. And then Jonas saw it. Just a flicker. A shape human ducking back behind the far wall of the half-collapsed livestock barn, not running, not stumbling, watching. Jonas stayed still. His hand went to the revolver beneath his coat, but he didn't draw. Not yet. Not out here. Not without knowing more. Ghost growled once low, instinctive, more warning than threat. Jonas whispered, "I see them." He didn't chase, didn't shout. He'd learned a long time ago that anyone brave enough to watch without being seen was rarely afraid of confrontation. Instead, he crouched near the truck, pulled open the glove box, and retrieved a small, weathered notepad, the same kind he used overseas, the same kind he stopped using when it stopped doing any good. With a pen that barely worked, he wrote 3 words on the first blank page: "It's not over." Then he tore it out, folded it once, and slid it between the pages of one of the transaction logs from the box, the one with his name. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe for the authorities, maybe for the person who was watching, maybe for himself. Ghost remained fixed on the barn, his body a silhouette of tension, but whoever had been there didn't return. No sound, no second glance, just absence. Jonas finally stood and looked at the barn one last time. His voice was gravel when he spoke, low enough that only Ghost heard it. "You wanted us to find it. Now we have." The wind shifted slightly. Pine needles rustled. And somewhere behind those broken boards, in the barn where no animals lived anymore, someone slipped away into the deeper dark. The tires crunched over gravel as Jonas pulled into the shaded back lot behind Merrick Veterinary Clinic. Bozeman hadn't changed much, at least not to Jonas. Same quiet storefronts, same mountains crouching in the distance like sleeping giants, but the past always looked frozen when you carried it like luggage. Ghost shifted slightly in the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the surroundings with that same alertness Jonas had come to understand. Not fear, not anticipation. Calculation. Jonas stepped out first and opened the passenger door. Ghost didn't leap out. He waited until Jonas nodded once. That silent agreement between them had become the only kind of language either of them needed. The lobby bell jingled as they entered. A receptionist looked up from a file folder but said nothing. She just gave Jonas a once over the coat, the scars, the silence, then buzzed someone in the back. Moments later she appeared. Dr. Alina Merrick. She hadn't aged in the way most people did. Her face was still stern, jaw tight, eyes cutting. But there was a new weariness behind her glasses, not tiredness, resignation. "Jonas," she said flatly, not quite a greeting. "Alina, you didn't call. Would you have answered?" She didn't reply, just stepped aside and nodded to the exam room. "Bring him in." The room was lit in soft yellow hues. Medical posters of canine anatomy clung to the walls, too clean, too cheerful for what Jonas carried in. Ghost stepped in without a leash. Didn't bark, didn't retreat, just stood, alert, but not stiff. Alina watched him carefully, not with fear, with that calm clinical dissection only those who had seen everything could manage. "He yours?" she asked, rolling a stool toward the metal table. "No one's," Jonas replied. "Not yet." "Name?" "Ghost." She clicked her pen. "Of course it is." He lifted Ghost gently onto the table, supporting his weight at the hip where the twist still lingered. The dog didn't resist, didn't flinch. Alina began the exam. Eyes, ears, joints. Multiple healed fractures, she murmured. Hip misalignment. Scarring consistent with deep tissue trauma. Some of it surgical, some not. Then her hand paused mid-motion. "What is it?" Jonas asked. She brushed back fur behind the left shoulder. A discoloration. Circular. Burnt. Another near the flank. Another just below the ribs. "Electrode burns," she said quietly. "Intentional. This was conditioning." Jonas felt his breath shallow. Ghost hadn't moved. Not a twitch, not a tremble. As if he knew that here, finally, pain didn't mean punishment. Alina scanned again, frowning. "Do you mind if I check for an embedded chip?" Jonas nodded once. She retrieved the scanner, passed it gently across Ghost's back. A soft beep. She tapped the screen and paused. "Registration tag, Bastion K9 Systems," she read aloud. "Status, archived. Owner, classified retrieved via private contract. Subtag, 1479. That's not a pet registry. That's government." Jonas leaned forward, his voice turned low. "You ever heard of Vincent Rourke?" Her head turned, eyes sharp now. "Jonas, why would you bring that name here?" "Because Ghost knew it before I said a word. And I think you and I are not the only ones who knew what that ranch really did." A silence stretched between them, longer than comfort, shorter than denial. She exhaled, sat down. Ghost stayed perfectly still, breathing slow. "You always knew how to find the wreckage," she whispered. The exam room felt colder now, not from temperature, but from truth. Dr. Alina Merrick stared at the handheld scanner like it had just spoken back to her. On the screen, a series of alphanumeric codes pulsed under the chip tag. 1479, BSTNVR, followed by the status, archived, retrieval cleared. Ghost remained motionless on the table, his chest rising and falling in the slow rhythm of learned stillness. Jonas stood at the foot, his fingers ghosting near the dog's shoulder, not touching, not commanding, just being there. "He's not a rescue," Alina finally murmured. "He's a survivor of a program no one's supposed to admit existed." "Bastion K9, Jonas said quietly, as if speaking the name too loud might summon shadows. She nodded grimly. "I thought they shut it down 5 years ago. But if he's chipped to them, and marked as retrieved—" Her voice trailed off as she reached for a drawer. She pulled out a thick folder, not medical charts, but copies of whistleblower documents. Scarred, water-stained. She had kept them all these years. "Look at this," she said, flipping to a page with diagrams, dog silhouettes marked with circles and electrical points. "Prodding zones," she said. "They used electroshock to create stimulus-triggered obedience. Sit, stay, attack. But it was deeper than training, it was conditioning. They rewired how the dogs understood safety and pain." She reached for a magnifier and pulled a small lamp over Ghost's side. As the light hit the fur just behind his front leg, Jonas saw them. Faint, raised circles. 4 in total. Each one correlates to a handler command. Except when the command changed, they'd rewire it with punishment. It's why dogs like him don't flinch at pain, they flinch at uncertainty. They're not afraid of harm. They're afraid of disobeying and not knowing why. Ghost didn't move, but his ears rotated slightly as if listening, as if understanding every word. "And the twisted leg?" Jonas asked. Alina nodded solemnly. Likely trauma from a containment unit collapse or forced long-jump training over unstable terrain. Not from neglect, deliberate overstress. They weren't just trying to create obedient dogs. They were trying to create silent weapons. Jonas leaned on the counter, gripping the edge. He'd been part of the machine once, not the core, but close enough to smell the smoke, close enough to have his name on the logistics ledgers. "Vincent Rourke," Alina whispered. "He was the architect behind Bastion. Former military intelligence. When the government pulled funding, he went private. Black site contracts. Wilcox Ranch was one of his test zones." Jonas swallowed. The bitter taste of memory coated his throat. "He was charming," Jonas said. "That kind of charming you don't see coming until it's wrapped around your neck." Elena didn't disagree. She turned back to Ghost and gently tapped the side of his jaw. "Open, boy," she said softly. To Jonas's shock, Ghost obeyed. Elena examined the gums, then pulled back the lip with slow precision. And there it was, a tiny barcode, laser-etched along the inside molar. "Identification beyond chips," she murmured. "They didn't want them getting lost. They wanted them tracked." Jonas's jaw clenched. Ghost's eyes met his. And in that stare, dull but endless, wasn't just exhaustion. It was betrayal made flesh. Jonas didn't say anything for a long time. The word was right there. Rourke, printed cleanly on the folder, Alina slid across the metal table. It might as well have been a landmine. Vincent Rourke, Bastion K9. Oversight Division filed under a header marked, "Decommission pending." But it hadn't been decommissioned. Not really. Jonas stared at the name, fingers resting near the edge of the folder like they were afraid to make contact. He knew that name better than most. Not from files, not from whispers, from drinks shared in dim-lit offices, from contracts slid across desks with a knowing look, from late-night calls where nothing was ever said directly, but everything was implied. Rourke didn't need to explain what Bastion was. He just needed people like Jonas, men with scars and silence, willing to move things, manage animals, escort cargo that barked. Jonas had told himself it wasn't his place to ask questions. That's how it always started, until it was too late. He pulled a chair out with a quiet scrape and sank into it like a man whose soul had just gained weight. Across the room, Ghost sat on the tile floor beside the exam table. He hadn't moved since the chip scan. His posture hadn't changed, but his eyes were watching Jonas. Not hostile, not accusatory, just aware. And that was somehow worse. Jonas couldn't hold the stare for long. He turned his gaze to the folder again and opened it slowly. Photos clipped to reports, satellite images, lists of K9 units and their kill switch codes. Each sheet a ledger of engineered loyalty until it wasn't. "You transported for him, didn't you?" Alina's voice was gentle, not accusing, just tired. Jonas nodded once. 3 years, in and out, ranches, supply drops, sometimes dogs, sometimes people. "Did you know what they were doing?" He breathed through his nose. Not the details, but enough. That silence wrapped around the room like fog. And then Ghost stood. His movement was slow but steady. He crossed the room, claws ticking softly against the tile, and stopped at Jonas's side. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just sat. Then placed one paw gently on Jonas's knee. Jonas flinched, not from fear, from shame. He hadn't earned that gesture. Not yet. Maybe never. He looked down and met Ghost's eyes again. But this time he didn't look away. "I saw your tag in a crate once," he whispered. "Just a number then, 1479. I unloaded you in the dark. No words, no light. I signed a form and walked away." Ghost didn't blink. "You already knew." The words hung in the air, though they were never spoken. Jonas reached up and rubbed a hand down his weathered face, then across the scar on his neck. One he got in a place he no longer talks about, doing a job that didn't deserve remembering. "I didn't know it was you," he said finally. "But I knew what they were making you do." A long silence followed. Elena didn't interrupt. She moved quietly to the sink, washed her hands, and left them alone in the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and breathing machines. Outside, snow had started to fall. Light, silent, indifferent. Jonas stood up slowly. "Come on, Ghost," he murmured. The dog moved without command, no hesitation. But just before they reached the door, Ghost paused. He turned his head back toward the exam room, and for a breath, just a breath, his ears lowered, not in fear, in grief. The cafe was half empty, the kind of place where no one asked questions if a man ordered coffee without sugar and kept the brim of his cap low. It smelled faintly of old linoleum, burnt toast, and pine cleaner, a forgotten corner of Bozeman where people came to disappear for a few hours or a lifetime. Jonas sat at the booth by the window. 2 mugs sat on the table, one untouched, one half empty, a skin forming on top of the lukewarm black coffee. Ghost lay under the table. Still, silent, a ghost in form and name. When the bell over the door jingled, Jonas didn't look up. He didn't need to. The boots were government issue. The jacket bore the faint outline of a badge. Deputy Marshal Lance Dwyer slid into the booth opposite without ceremony. He didn't smile. "Jonas," he said flatly. "Dwyer." Jonas nodded once. There were no pleasantries, no feigned surprise, only the quiet tension of men who'd spent too long carrying truths they'd never said aloud. Jonas reached into the satchel beside him, pulled out a folder bound with twine, edges worn and corners water-damaged. He laid it on the table like an offering. No drama. Just wait. "What's this?" Jonas slid it forward. "Photos. Names. Tags. Dogs. Humans. Payment logs. Transport authorizations. One for every trip I made to Wilcox Ranch. And one with my signature next to Unit 1479. He didn't look at Dwyer when he said it. He couldn't. Ghost shifted beneath the table but made no sound. Dwyer flipped open the file slowly. A few pages in, his brow creased. Another page. A Polaroid. A scarred shepherd behind a caged door. He stopped turning. Jonas waited and waited. Finally Dwyer exhaled, slow and low, like someone forcing poison from their lungs. "How long have you had this?" "Long enough. Long enough to have spoken up years ago." Jonas didn't blink. "I know." Dwyer's eyes flicked down again, then back up harder this time. "You helped them." Jonas didn't flinch. "Yes." "You signed off on the transports." "I did." "You looked away." Jonas's voice cracked like old leather. "Every damn time." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, saturated. Outside, snow was gathering along the windowsill, turning the street into a watercolor of gray and white. Finally, Dwyer leaned back. He rubbed a thumb over his temple. "Why now?" he asked, the words soft. Not accusatory, just tired. "Why not when those dogs were still screaming in those cages? Why not when it could have made a difference? Jonas looked down at the coffee, then at the folder. Then finally he met Dwyer's gaze and answered, "Because I saw his eyes." Dwyer didn't speak. Jonas kept going. "The first night I brought him home, he wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep, just watched. He didn't growl, didn't bark, just watched, like he was waiting for the pain to start again." He paused. The memory scratched at his voice. "And when I brushed too close to an old scar, he didn't bite. He apologized for flinching." Ghost shifted again beneath the table, his breathing steady. "That's not training," Jonas whispered. "That's programming. That's what happens when someone takes loyalty and turns it into obedience without soul. When someone like Rourke convinces you that a dog's just a tool and that tools don't feel." He looked away again, hands tightening. "I saw my own reflection in him, and I hated it." Dwyer closed the file. "That enough to bring charges?" Jonas shook his head. "Not yet, but it's enough to reopen the Wilcox investigation. Enough to look at Bastion K9 and start asking the right questions." A pause, then, "I'm not asking for a clean slate, Marshal. I know. I'm trying to stop running from the pieces I left behind." They sat in silence, and then, quietly, Dwyer reached into his jacket, pulled out a business card, slid it across the table. "I'll take this to the Bureau. Quietly. Let it build. But if you vanish before I call, we're done. You hear me?" Jonas nodded once. "I'll be here." Dwyer stood, then paused. His eyes dropped to Ghost beneath the table. They locked eyes, and something unspoken passed between man and dog. Respect, wariness, recognition. Then he left. The door jingled shut behind him. Jonas sat for another full minute, unmoving, then reached down. Ghost lifted his head. Jonas whispered, "You ready?" The tail thumped once. He was. The wind had picked up by the time Jonas turned onto the gravel drive leading to the cabin. Snow hadn't started yet, but the air had that smell-cold bark, old stone, and the ghost of winter waiting behind the ridgeline. Inside, the cabin was dim, the last light of day filtering through wood-framed windows coated in dust. Jonas didn't bother flipping on the overhead lamp. He moved by muscle memory. He opened the hall closet. Out came a canvas duffel bag. The zipper stuck halfway, like it always did. He didn't fight it, just yanked harder. Each item was chosen deliberately. A length of rope, a rust-scratched flashlight, extra batteries, 2 protein bars, expired probably, but still sealed. And finally, the old revolver. He held it in his hand for a long moment. Not to load it, just to feel the weight again. The cold truth of steel that never lied. The same revolver he hadn't touched since the day he walked away from Wilcox. When he turned, Ghost was already sitting in the center of the room, head tilted, ears half back, not in fear, but in understanding. Jonas didn't speak. He didn't have to. He slid open the bottom drawer of the side table and pulled out a folded map, spread it over the wood countertop, marked a point, Coyote Gulch, circled it. A location burned into his memory not for what it was, but what it used to be. A drop point, a silent zone, where certain cargo changed hands and no one asked questions. Ghost padded forward, silent as smoke, and placed his paw on the map, directly over the circle. Jonas blinked. He hadn't taught the dog that, hadn't needed to. "All right," he muttered. "You know the trail." He rolled up the map and slipped it into the bag. Out on the porch, the wind hissed through the pines. Darkness had settled over Clearwater like a second skin. Jonas opened the door. The cold met him like an old friend, sharp, honest, unapologetic. He slung the duffel over one shoulder, took the revolver in the other hand, then locked eyes with Ghost. The shepherd didn't wait for a command. He turned, trotted down the steps, and leapt into the truck's passenger side like he belonged there, because now he did. Jonas followed. He tossed the duffel into the back seat, slid into the driver's seat, and sat for a beat with the engine off, just listening. Ghost stared out the windshield. There was no wagging tail, no panting excitement, just readiness. Jonas turned the key. The truck growled to life. As they rolled down the winding road, the pines swayed on either side like sentries, bowing low in the growing wind. The headlights caught the frost, swirling across the ground like breath from something bigger than either of them. He reached over, let his hand rest gently on Ghost's shoulder. No command, no words. Ghost leaned in, just a little. They didn't know everything waiting at the end of the road, but they knew they wouldn't be facing it alone. The truck rolled to a stop at the edge of Wilcox Ranch just as the sky began to bleed from black into gray. Dawn didn't rise here, it crept, as if the sun itself hesitated to touch the land. Frost clung to the ground like breath held too long. Everything was quiet, too quiet, as if the world remembered what had happened here and dared not speak. Jonas stepped out first, boots crunching against the brittle ground. The air smelled like old wood and something older forgotten things buried too shallow. Ghost jumped down beside him, nose twitching. His stance shifted, alert, not tense but resolute, as if his body remembered something his mind refused to let fade. Jonas slung the duffel over his shoulder and followed Ghost through the broken fence line, past the collapsed corral toward a slope behind the farthest shed, an area Jonas had never been told to approach during his transport days. Ghost moved with purpose, each step guided by something more ancient than memory. Instinct, grief, a promise made in silence. The shepherd stopped at the edge of a gnarled tree line and let out a single low whine. Not fear, not pain, a warning. This is it. Jonas hesitated, then stepped forward. The ground looked no different than the rest-scattered pine needles, frost-bitten grass, patches of frozen earth. But Ghost began to dig. Not frantically, precisely, deliberately, like he'd already done this before. Jonas knelt beside him, pulling gloves tighter as his fingers met the hard-packed soil. They dug together, man and dog, both scarred by the same institution, both trying to uncover what had been hidden for far too long. The first thing they hit was a fragment of leather, then bone, then another. Jonas didn't speak. He just sat back on his heels as Ghost stepped aside, letting the wind blow through the shallow hole. There were no coffins, no markers, just 5 shallow graves. No names, just bones, collars, rusted tags. Jonas reached down and pulled one free. It bore a number, not a name. 1 Fringe 73. He checked the next. 1480. Another, K9 1492, decommissioned. Ghost stood at the edge of the pit, eyes focused not on the bones, but on Jonas, as if to say, "This is the truth you didn't want to see." Jonas's chest tightened, not because of surprise, because he knew. He'd helped offload these dogs, had driven them down roads in the dark, had seen the crates, heard the scratching, pretended it was cargo. And now the cargo had names, faces, silent screams echoing up from the soil. He rose slowly, breathing shallow, and looked out across the field. There could be more, dozens more. He reached into his duffel and pulled out his notebook. tore a page free, wrote 5 numbers, circled each one. Then, for the first time in over a decade, Jonas knelt, not in shame, not in guilt, in mourning. He placed the paper into the grave and whispered, "They won't stay forgotten." Ghost moved to his side and pressed against him, leaning slightly just enough to say, "You're not the only one who carries this." Jonas stood again, looked toward the barn, then toward the rising sun. It would be light soon, and this time the light would tell everything. Inside the half-collapsed shed at the edge of Wilcox Ranch, dust hung in the air like smoke from an old fire. The boards creaked under Jonas's boots, brittle with time and rot. Sunlight pierced through broken slats in thin, hesitant lines, searchlights scanning a room that had tried too long to hide. Ghost moved ahead, nose low, steps cautious but sure. His ears were sharp, twitching toward every creak and whisper of wind. He paused at a rusted metal cabinet bolted into the far corner, its paint peeled like dead bark. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just stared. Jonas approached, crowbar in hand. 2 hard pulls, and the cabinet shrieked open. Inside, rows of file folders warped by moisture, a box labeled RET 1490, and a stack of yellowed manila envelopes bound in rotting twine. Ghost didn't move until Jonas pulled the box down. The weight wasn't in the paper, it was in what came with it. Jonas flipped open the lid and froze. Photos? Dozens, maybe more. Each one a Polaroid. Grainy, time-stamped, numbered. Most showed cages. Some showed wounds. But one... He pulled it gently from the rest, the edges curling at the corners, the ink faded, but intact. In the photo, a young German shepherd pup, barely past adolescence, locked inside a crate no bigger than a dishwasher. Muzzle scarred, one ear tipped unnaturally from poor healing, eyes not wide with fear, but narrowed with something older, wiser. A tag hung from the crate's door. 1479, male, K9, conditioned. Jonas's breath hitched. Ghost, standing beside him now, lowered his head toward the image, gave a low, almost inaudible whimper. Not pain, recognition. He was looking at himself. Jonas turned the photo over, scrawled in rushed handwriting on the back. 1479, stable, quiet, cleared for retrieval. Initials, and a date. He knew that date, knew it too well. His hand reached almost involuntarily for the bottom of the box. Beneath the folders lay a tattered, ledger-thick, cracked at the spine, smudged with the fingerprints of men who'd never be punished. He flipped pages until he found it. February 18th, row 11. Transport, Jonas Blake. 1479, cleared. Signed, V. Rourke. He stared at his name, then at Ghost, then back at the photo. His fingers trembled slightly as he closed the ledger and sat back against the wall. Everything he had hoped wasn't true. Was. He wasn't just a man who'd looked the other way. He'd driven the truck. He'd signed the release. He'd brought Ghost into hell long before he ever tried to bring him out. Ghost sat beside him now, silent, not judging. Just there. Jonas looked at the old dog older now than he had any right to be, and whispered, "I was the one. I brought you in." Ghost blinked, then did something unexpected. He leaned, not much, just a shift of weight, a small contact. Enough. Jonas pressed the photo to his chest. And for the first time since this started, not just the digging or the uncovering, but the guilt that came before, he let himself grieve. Not just for the dog, for the boy he used to be, the man he became, and the one he was trying to become now. Outside, wind rustled the dry grass. The past had a heartbeat again, and this time it was louder than silence. The sheriff's office in Bozeman hadn't changed much in 20 years. The wood-paneled walls still carried the faint scent of sweat and coffee. The old clock above the booking counter ticked too loudly. Somewhere in the back, a radio hummed with dispatch chatter. Jonas pushed open the door just after dawn. Ghost followed close, padding silently over the linoleum. His gait still carried a trace of stiffness, but his eyes were sharper now, no longer darting, no longer waiting for something to fall. The canvas bag in Jonas's left hand sagged with weight, not just from the contents, but from what they meant. Deputy Marshal Lance Dwyer looked up from behind the desk, mug in hand, eyes red from too little sleep and too much thinking. He didn't stand, didn't smile, just nodded once. "You're early." Jonas didn't answer. He stepped forward, placed the bag on the desk, and let it fall with a muted thud. Dust shook free from the seams. Dwyer stared at it. Jonas unzipped it slowly, pulling back the canvas flap to reveal what he'd carried in silence. A stack of ledgers, folders marked 1479, conditioned assets, transfer approvals, the photo, and finally the ledger with his own signature, the one that mattered most. Jonas looked up, voice low. "This is everything." Dwyer didn't touch the papers at first. He reached for the photograph instead, the one of the young dog behind bars, ears too large for his head, eyes already too old. He exhaled slowly. "This is the dog?" he asked. Ghost stood at attention, as if answering without needing words. Jonas nodded. Dwyer reached next for the ledger, opened it to the page Jonas had marked with an old matchbook. He read in silence for several seconds before finally muttering, "Vincent Rourke. Jesus. He's still out there," Jonas said. Dwyer looked up. "You sure?" Jonas didn't blink. "Someone was watching us at Wilcox. Didn't run. Just waited." He let the weight of that sentence settle. Dwyer closed the ledger, placed both hands on it like it was a Bible he'd been waiting to swear on. Then, softly, he said, "This reopens everything." Jonas nodded. "I know. We'll need your statement recorded." "I already wrote it," Jonas replied, pulling a second, smaller notebook from his coat. "Names, locations, what I knew, what I didn't ask." Dwyer accepted it with a grim nod. Silence stretched between them for a long moment. Then the marshal leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning over the contents of the bag again. "You understand what this means, right?" he said finally. Jonas didn't flinch. "It means this ends with him, not with Ghost." Ghost, still beside him, lifted his head slightly at the sound of his name. Dwyer stood slowly, walked to the bulletin board behind the desk, cleared a space with one sweep of his hand, and pinned the Polaroid photo dead center. He looked at it for a long time. Then he spoke, not to Jonas, not even really to himself, more like a vow to the picture. "All right then, we hunt." Jonas turned without another word and headed for the door. Ghost followed, one silent step at a time. The door creaked open, and the Montana air met them, brisk, sharp, and brimming with a promise neither of them said out loud, not revenge, not redemption, but something colder, something older, justice. And it had finally begun. The streets of Bozeman had never felt louder. It wasn't the noise, traffic was light, conversations hushed beneath the cloudy morning sky. No, the volume came from the eyes, the weight of attention that followed every step Jonas and Ghost took down Main Street. There was no leash, no collar, no need. Ghost walked by Jonas's side with the quiet dignity of someone who had earned every scar, every stare. His posture had changed since that first limp across the auction lot. His head no longer hung low, his tail no longer curled beneath him. Now he moved with purpose-measured steps, alert gaze, a kind of stillness that made people pause. They noticed. It started with whispers. "Is that the dog from— Wait, I saw him. The photo, right? That's the guy. The one who— What did they say? He exposed something?" A woman exiting the bakery froze mid-step, a coffee cup trembling in her hand. A barista inside leaned toward the glass, eyes wide. Someone across the street pulled out a phone. The photo. The file. The story had already begun to spread quietly, like wind through pine, not because Jonas wanted it to, because truth doesn't ask permission. Ghost glanced briefly at a small child sitting cross-legged on the sidewalk. The boy blinked up, chewing a donut, face sticky with sugar and wonder. For a moment, Ghost slowed just a fraction, and the boy smiled. Jonas didn't speak, but he noticed the boy's mother gently pulling her son closer, as if unsure. And yet, she didn't leave. No one did. They watched. They waited. And Ghost kept walking, past the cafe window where an older couple sat, murmuring behind newspapers now lowered in stunned recognition, past the bookstore where someone stepped outside and said, "Bless you both," so softly it was swallowed by the breeze. Jonas said nothing. But inside a storm churned, not of pride, not of fear, of memory. Every step down that street was a fracture repaired, every silent acknowledgement a stitch. Because he had once walked these same sidewalks in a different life, in a different skin, hiding from what he'd been a part of. Now he walked beside the consequence of it. And the redemption. They passed a bulletin board near the city center. It had posters for missing dogs, community fundraisers, and beneath a sheet of clear plastic, a newly printed flyer. "Do you know this dog? German Shepherd, male, former K9 unit, last seen with retired veteran Jonas Hart. If you have information regarding Bastion, K9, or associated programs, please contact—" Someone had pinned a single flower beneath it. Ghost stopped, sniffed, then moved on, as if even he knew that recognition could never replace what was lost, but it could honor it. They turned the corner toward the old hardware store. A teenage clerk stepped outside, phone in hand, and raised it, nervous, unsure. Jonas met his gaze. "No photos," he said, not unkindly. The kid lowered the phone immediately. "Sorry, sir." Ghost paused long enough to glance at the boy. His ears twitched, subtle, curious. Then the moment passed. Back into the movement, back into the eyes. The walk took only 10 minutes. But it felt like a lifetime measured in nods, sidelong glances, and the raw quiet of a town trying to understand what it had just become part of. By the time Jonas and Ghost reached the edge of downtown, a dozen phones had captured their path, but not one person had stepped forward to touch the dog. There was something sacred in the space Ghost carried. Not fear, respect. Jonas glanced down as they reached the crosswalk. Ghost sat on his own, looked both ways, waited. Jonas smiled faintly, the first time in days. "You remember that one?" They crossed together, no leash, no command, no hurry, and the world watched them go. not out of spectacle, but because deep down, even strangers can recognize when a soul decides it's done being silent. The road to the back of Jonas's property was little more than a path carved by time and old tire tracks lined with pines that seemed to remember what silence was supposed to feel like. As the sun climbed through a gauze of soft clouds, the wind carried the smell of damp earth, of wood smoke long gone, of something new forming beneath what was once abandoned. Ghost sat in the bed of the truck, head tilted slightly, ears moving with each turn of the engine. He didn't fidget, didn't whine, he just watched. Jonas pulled the truck to a stop in a small clearing. The trees bowed away here, as if making room for something that hadn't been born yet. He climbed out slowly. His knees creaked, reminders that time had never made a gentleman of him. "You coming?" he asked over his shoulder. Ghost jumped down with practiced ease, landing softly beside him. No leash, no prompt, just presence. Jonas walked a few paces ahead, then stopped and pointed. What lay before them wasn't much yet. Just a stretch of land framed by wooden stakes and bright orange flagging tape. A small shed with a tarp-covered roof. Rolls of fencing leaned against the wall. A makeshift workbench under a canvas canopy. But there, nailed to a tree, was a weathered hand-drawn map. The blueprint. Lines, circles, notes in red ink. Kennels. Natural cover. No chains. Medical wing here. Trees stay. Fireplace. Not furnace. Ghost padded up beside him, nose twitching as he sniffed the soil. His gaze moved over the open space, the distant stream that whispered beyond the brush. Jonas didn't speak at first. Then, quietly, with a voice worn thin by memory, "This is for you." Ghost turned his head, watching him. No more cages, no numbers, no shock collars, just trees, dirt, space to breathe. He knelt beside the nearest stake and pulled from his coat a small crumpled paper, unfolded it, pressed it flat against his thigh. Across the top, written in black marker, "Clearwater Refuge." "Figured you'd be the first," Jonas said. "Someone's got to test it out." Ghost didn't move, didn't bark, just leaned slightly, his side resting against Jonas's knee. Jonas froze. It wasn't much, barely a shift in weight. But it wasn't fear. It wasn't obedience. It was choice. Jonas's eyes didn't water, not exactly, but his voice thinned. "I was part of something that broke dogs like you. Didn't raise a hand, but I didn't stop it either. This," he gestured at the clearing, the quiet, the plan. "This is my way of saying I'm not done trying." The wind moved through the trees like a hush, like approval. Ghost moved forward toward the edge of the stream and lay down. His ears stayed alert. But he didn't pace, didn't scan. He rested. And for the first time since Jonas had seen him, his tail brushed the ground. Once, slow, like punctuation. Jonas let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, then walked over to the shed and pulled out two things, a shovel and a metal post. Ghost rose to his feet. Curious, Jonas drove the post into the ground, packed the dirt around it, then raised the attached plank of wood. Faded white paint spelled two words, "Home starts here." Ghost sat beside it. Jonas stood next to him, hand brushing the dog's back, not petting, just near. They stayed like that for a while, not moving, not needing to. The pines watched in silence, because sometimes the beginning of freedom isn't a gate swinging open. It's a man and a dog, standing on soil that no one will take from them again. The morning air carried the scent of sawdust and pine, mingling with the faint metallic tang of old nails and sweat. Jonas stood over a pile of reclaimed wooden boards, sleeves rolled to the elbows, hands cracked and calloused with age, but steady. Behind him, the early light filtered through tall evergreens, casting slanted shadows across the clearing where the future was being drawn, one fence post at a time. Ghost sat nearby, his body at ease, but his eyes never straying far. He tracked every movement Jonas made, not out of distrust, but out of something deeper: recognition, belonging. Jonas drove the first post into the soil with the rhythmic thud of a manual tamping tool. The sound didn't startle Ghost anymore. Not today. "These aren't walls," Jonas muttered, as if to himself, the post wobbling slightly before he drove it in deeper. "They're promises." Ghost's ears twitched. Jonas looked over. "You don't build a refuge by locking it. You shape it around trust, around freedom." The boards they used were mismatched. Some had once been part of old barn siding. Others had rusted nails sticking out that Jonas pulled carefully with the back of his hammer. He didn't mind the work. In fact, he welcomed it. It was honest. Each nail he hammered in was a memory he made peace with, one less thing to carry inside his chest. Ghost approached and stood by a half-assembled section of fencing, nose twitching, tail low but not tucked. He sniffed a board that had a painted number faded but still visible. Jonas followed his gaze. "That one used to belong to a corral," he said softly. "Held animals that were sold for what they could offer. But now—" He ran a hand across the plank. "Now it'll hold nothing. Just space. Just air." He knelt and patted the ground. Ghost came forward. Together they worked. Jonas hammered. Ghost watched. Jonas dug. Ghost paced the perimeter like a sentinel. When Jonas stepped back to wipe sweat from his brow, Ghost rested his chin on the top rail of the newly completed section, eyes fixed on the horizon, where the trees thinned and the lake shimmered in the distance. No fences would block the view. That was important. "This side," Jonas said, pointing toward the distant water. "That's open, always. If you want to leave, you can." Ghost looked at him, held his gaze, then turned and walked back to the center of the clearing. He wasn't leaving. The hours passed. The sun climbed. They didn't speak, not with words. Jonas hummed an old tune once, and Ghost tilted his head like he was trying to remember it. At one point, a hawk passed overhead. Ghost tracked it with his eyes, unmoving. Jonas looked up, too. "You ever wonder what it's like?" he asked. "To fly and never be caged?" Ghost gave no answer, but his tail thumped once. Jonas took it as a yes. By late afternoon, they had a rough outline of the eastern boundary posts rising like quiet sentinels from the ground, stitched together with wire fencing low enough not to trap, but high enough to define. It wasn't about keeping things in. It was about keeping nightmares out. Jonas stood with his hands on his hips, back aching, but heart lighter than it had been in years. "One day," he whispered, "others will come. Dogs like you. Dogs no one else wants to fix." Ghost moved beside him, pressing shoulder to leg. "But we'll be here," Jonas continued, his voice rough. "And they'll know they're safe, because you'll be the first one they see." Ghost didn't flinch when Jonas placed a hand on his back, didn't shy away, didn't tremble, just stood, rooted, steady, like a tree that had finally found its ground. And in the distance, the lake glimmered beneath the light of a sun that seemed at last to approve. The mornings were no longer silent. They began with a soft thud pause padding across old wood floors. the muffled jingle of the handmade leather tag Ghost wore now, not as a claim of ownership, but as a promise that he had a place. Outside, mist hugged the edge of the lake. The pine trees held on to last night's dew, dripping slowly like time itself had chosen to move more gently here. In the middle of the clearing, where fence posts now outlined a future, Ghost lay sprawled in the sunlight. For the first time since Jonas had brought him home, the dog slept, not just with closed eyes, but with muscles slack, breathing even. No twitch, no whimper, just sleep. Jonas didn't disturb him. He stood on the porch steps, coffee steaming in one hand, a weathered journal in the other. The pages inside were still mostly blank, except for the title written in sharp, careful strokes at the top of page 1, Beginning. He didn't need to write much yet. Today the silence said enough. Mid-morning, Ghost stirred. He rose slowly, shook out his coat, and padded toward the porch with a loose gait that hadn't been there weeks ago. The limp remained, it always would, but something had changed in how he carried it. It no longer looked like a wound. It looked like memory. Jonas smiled without meaning to. "You sleep like you've forgotten the war," he murmured. Ghost's ears flicked forward, then relaxed. He settled beside Jonas, leaned into the man's leg not for reassurance, but out of habit, out of trust. Jonas scratched behind his ear, gentle and slow. "You earned that nap." Later, Jonas brought out an old rubber ball, faded red, still had teeth marks from a dog long gone. He rolled it once across the clearing. Ghost watched it go, didn't chase it, but didn't flinch either. The second time he took a step, then another. By the third roll he bounded forward clumsy, unsure, like he was trying on someone else's memory. His front paw snagged the edge of the ball and sent it tumbling sideways. He turned too fast, stumbled, then stopped, head low, as if embarrassed. Jonas didn't laugh. He just said, "Try again." And Ghost did. No one taught him how. No praise, no clicker training. Just time, just space. By sundown he was panting with his tongue lolling out, tail thumping against the grass as if he'd found something older than commands. Joy. Jonas opened the journal again. This time he wrote, "He ran today, not from anything just because he could." That night, Ghost lay curled near the hearth again, but different now, legs kicked out, chin resting on a folded towel he'd claimed as his own. His chest rose and fell in slow, even rhythm. No nightmares chased him. No muscles jerked him awake. Jonas sat nearby with his journal. He stared at the flame, listening to the crackle of burning pine, the occasional sigh from the dog beside him. Then he whispered, "You're free now, Ghost." No one heard but the fire and the dog, and that was enough. The static hum of the old television filled the cabin, flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Jonas never liked that screen hadn't turned it on in years. It had gathered dust in the corner beside a cracked bookshelf and a shelf of VHS tapes no one watched anymore. But this morning he made an exception. Not for himself, for Ghost. The German shepherd lay curled by the hearth, head resting on crossed paws, body still. But his ears never stopped listening. The moment the TV came to life, he lifted his head, eyes locked on the screen like it held something more than noise. And it did. A chyron slid across the bottom in red, breaking arrest warrant issued for Vincent Rourke, Bastion K9, under federal investigation. A female anchor, polished and distant, reported from the courthouse steps. Multiple sources confirmed that federal agents, acting on new photographic and testimonial evidence, have linked Bastion K-9's founder Vincent Rourke to a string of classified military contracts involving the use of unauthorized behavioral conditioning on service animals. Ghost's ears twitched. Then he stood, not fast, not startled, purposeful. He moved to the screen and sat, watching. Jonas stood behind him, arms folded, leaning against the doorframe like a man bracing for an old storm. "They're saying your name now," he muttered, almost to himself. "Just not out loud." The footage cut to a press conference, officials in suits, journalists barking questions, flashbulbs. Words like inhumane, contractual breach, systemic abuse flew across the airwaves like bullets. But Jonas didn't smile, didn't nod. He looked at Ghost. That was enough. The justice system had picked up the scent, but Ghost had carried the weight. Every scar, every twitch at a sudden noise, every sleepless night. Those weren't part of the broadcast. They wouldn't make the headlines. But they were the real story. The camera cut to the image of Rourke's silver hair, restrained in cuffs, jaw clenched, as marshals led him away. He didn't fight. He didn't shout. He just looked up, right into the lens, as if daring the world to call him a villain. Ghost didn't growl. He didn't bark. But his tail lifted stiffly behind him, ears forward, stare unwavering, recognition, and maybe, just maybe, vindication. Jonas turned the volume down. The anchor's voice faded into a whisper, overtaken by the crackle of the fire and the low hum of pine wind against the cabin windows. He walked to the journal on the table and wrote only one line. "Justice doesn't bark. It endures." Outside they heard it, tires on gravel, doors slamming, voices calling. News crews. Jonas didn't flinch. He didn't hide either. He simply opened the cabin door, stood tall on the porch, and waited. A woman with a microphone called out, "Mr. Callahan, is it true you used to work for Bastion K-9? Did you know what was happening?" He said nothing. Another voice, "What made you speak out now? Why come forward after all these years?" Jonas stepped off the porch, Ghost beside him, neither on leash nor command. He walked to the edge of the fence, the one they'd built together, not as a prison, but as a promise. "I didn't come forward," he finally said, voice low. He did. He nodded toward Ghost. The reporters fell silent. For one long breath, no one said a word. Then the cameras clicked again. Microphones reached out. But Jonas turned his back to them. He walked away. Ghost followed. Because justice, real justice, doesn't need applause. It needs someone to carry the story, and someone else to believe it. The fence wasn't finished, but the gate never closed. Not after the news broke. Not after the world saw the footage of the man and the dog, one scarred in the soul, the other in flesh standing silent outside a wooden cabin while a nation whispered their names. People came. At first, they came in silence, veterans who didn't speak but nodded, hands trembling just slightly as they reached to touch Ghost's fur. Some left challenge coins at the fence post, others knelt, eyes brimming, before standing wordlessly and walking away. Jonas never asked why they came. He just watched Ghost receive them all. It wasn't the tail wags that moved people, it was the stillness, that quiet, grounded presence. A dog who had known hell and chose not to pass it on. By the end of the first week, Clearwater Refuge had visitors daily. Some brought food, some brought stories. Some just sat on the grass and listened to wind through the pines. Then one morning, a rusted blue pickup arrived. Jonas was already up, repairing a section of fence, when he saw it roll to a stop by the old well. Dust clouded the air. A man stepped out, mid-40s, lean, tattoos across his left arm, a Marine Corps emblem faded on his shirt sleeve. He said nothing, just opened the passenger door, and out came a puppy, small, wiry, a mix of German Shepherd and something else wilder. Its ribs showed faintly under a patchy coat. But what stopped Jonas cold were the scars, not healed clean, patterned, intentional, the kind you had to mean to leave. Jonas dropped the hammer in his hand. Ghost was already walking toward them. The pup didn't bark, didn't growl, just stood frozen beside the truck tire, body low, legs trembling but unbroken. Ghost stopped a few feet away and lowered himself to the ground. Not threatening, not dominant, just present. The man, his name would later be given as Carter Lane, nodded toward Jonas. "She don't trust anyone. Ain't her fault." Jonas said nothing. Carter looked down, voice rough. "Found her behind a trailer in Jackson County. Heard about you on the news. Figured if anyone knew what to do." He trailed off, swallowing hard. Jonas walked over slowly, crouched beside the pup, whose eyes tracked his every move like a cornered animal. He didn't reach out, just lowered his hand beside her in the dirt. Minutes passed. Then, timidly, painfully, one paw stepped forward. Her nose touched his wrist. Jonas closed his eyes. Ghost didn't move, just watched. Carter cleared his throat. "She ain't got a name." Jonas opened his eyes. "She'll find it," he said softly. Then he stood, gave Carter a nod, and gently clicked his tongue. The pup followed him into the clearing. No leash, no command, just choice. Carter watched them disappear between the trees, then got in his truck and drove off without another word. That night, Jonas sat by the fire with a new entry in the journal labeled "Beginning." He didn't write much, just this: "Some scars don't fade, but sometimes they lead others home." And beside him, Ghost lay curled, not alone anymore. A new breath stirred beside him in sleep, and the refuge had begun. The fog rolled in slow like forgiveness. It clung to the pine trunks and drifted over the surface of the lake in ribbons, soft as breath. The water barely moved, just the occasional ripple, stirred by something unseen beneath. Jonas sat on the worn bench he'd carved himself, boots planted in cold soil, hands folded in quiet thought. His coat hung open. The rifle wasn't with him. He didn't need it anymore. Ghost lay beside him, head resting gently against Jonas's knee. The old shepherd's eyes were half-lidded, his breathing slow, steady-like. He could sleep forever in that moment if the world would just hold still. They'd come so far. The bruises on Ghost's soul were no longer fresh, still present, but no longer bleeding. Jonas had seen the signs. The way the dog now greeted the morning with a slow stretch instead of a startle. The way he leaned into touch without flinching. The way he had taught a scarred puppy how to trust a hand again. But Jonas wasn't sure he deserved to be healed too. He looked out across the lake, the same one that reflected his regrets on sleepless nights, and let the silence do what words never could. Then, very softly, he spoke. "You saved me too, you know." Ghost didn't lift his head, just thumped his tail once against the earth. That was enough. Jonas swallowed, voice dry. I thought I came here to disappear, to forget. The fog curled around his boots as if listening. But you made me remember every damn thing, the jobs I took, the orders I didn't question, the silence I let settle when others screamed. Ghost blinked, one ear twitching. I don't expect forgiveness, Jonas whispered, eyes fixed on the stillness. But I needed to face it, and you, damn it, you made me face it. His hand lowered, fingers brushing fur as familiar now as old scars. I called you Ghost because you didn't belong to this world. But maybe, he paused, maybe you're what pulled me back into it. Ghost lifted his head slightly, eyes meeting Jonas's. No growl, no command, no bark, just presence, just understanding. Jonas chuckled under his breath, low and dry. Still don't say much, huh? Another tail thump. Somewhere in the trees behind them, the new pup barked once, clumsy, high-pitched, uncertain. The sound echoed faintly off the water and was swallowed by the fog. Ghost didn't move. He knew the bark wasn't a warning. Just life. Jonas leaned back slightly on the bench. Let the weight of all the years settle into his bones without pressing him under. For once, it didn't feel like drowning. He closed his eyes. Let the silence stretch long between them, not heavy but full. And in that space fog curling around the clearing, water whispering to the shore, and a dog's head resting warm against a man's knee, Jonas understood something he hadn't before. Redemption didn't need an audience. It didn't wear medals. It didn't march or beg for praise. Sometimes redemption arrived on 4 quiet paws and just stayed. In a world where silence often hides pain, stories like Ghosts remind us that healing doesn't always come with words. It comes with trust, presence, and quiet acts of courage. This tale wasn't just about a dog rescued from the brink. It was about what happens when 2 broken souls meet in the stillness and decide to walk forward together. German shepherds, like Ghost, are more than protectors. They are survivors, teachers, companions with hearts far deeper than most will ever know. They feel, they remember, and when given the chance, they forgive. This story leaves us with more than just emotion. It offers a message that redemption is real, that second chances matter, that even the deepest scars, whether on skin or soul, can soften in the presence of kindness. So if this journey moved you, hold it close. Let it remind you to see beyond fear, to open your door to love, even when it comes on 4 cautious paws, and to believe truly that no creature is ever too far gone to begin again, because sometimes the ones we save are the ones who save us.